Welcome to the CMO Spotlight, and I'm here with Devika Mathrani, who is the Chief Marketing Officer for NewYork-Presbyterian. Welcome, Devika.
Thank you, Joe. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. So I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. I wondered if we could just start off with you telling us a little bit more about the organization NewYork-Presbyterian for those that aren't aware of it.
Yeah, so NewYork-Presbyterian is one of the largest hospital systems within New York, and we actually are made up of 11 hospitals, 200 doctors' offices, and just an incredibly large frontline team that is sort of taking care of New Yorkers every day. But we also are a nationally known hospital for expertise in cardiology, neurology, taking care of women, and so many expertise. I actually joined NewYork-Presbyterian in July of 2021 as the Chief Marketing and Communications Officer. And it has been just an incredible journey getting to know this institution since I actually came out of financial services after 22 years.
And obviously joined during COVID too, so that makes for interesting times, I'm sure, at a hospital system.
Absolutely. You know, it's I think come outside in, before I joined the hospital, I obviously had just incredible respect for what healthcare workers were doing. Once I joined the institution and just got to know the doctors, the nurses, the physician assistants, the people that take care of our facilities, the people that deliver the food, you think about people that clean up operating rooms, you know, you're almost in awe of the choice that healthcare workers have made. Just to take care of sort of their fellow man and to take care of their fellow colleagues and people across the city.
Amazing. So if you could just tell us a little bit about your role as Chief Marketing and Communications Officer, what does that entail? And, you know, what does your team look like too? I'm curious about that.
Absolutely. So I often say to people that I think of myself as sort of the steward of the brand, as well as the voice of the customer. And in so many different ways, whether or not it's how we show up in digital, whether it's sharing our patient stories with the world, whether or not it's articulating our expertise to the marketplace, it's really about making sure people understand everything that NewYork-Presbyterian can do for you as a consumer and bringing those stories to life in the market. And, you know, particularly right now, I think where consumers have become so much more focused on health and wellness in their life, people don't think about, you know, they don't just think about health and wellness when they're sick and they say, oh, I got to get better. People now think about health and wellness in a very proactive way. You know, whether or not you get up in the morning and you have, you know, 7 minutes of mindfulness, or whether you're hopping on a bike and you're doing a spin class or you're going for a run, health and wellness is a part of people's everyday life. And so when I think about my role, it's about shaping that message in the marketplace. How do we want to position ourselves in the mind of the consumer, and also helping to shape that patient experience, not just when you're in an appointment or walking in the halls of the hospital, but how do we be a part of people's everyday wellness journey, sort of from the everyday care that they need all the way to the extraordinary care in the event that they are sick or they are unwell. And I think that's really different than I think that the healthcare used to think about the role that they play than it was 5-10 years ago.
It used to just be sick care, to your point, and now it's about total wellness and how do you keep the person from cradle to grave, you know, as healthy as they can possibly be.
Exactly. I think, you know, in today's day and age, people are seeking out information, whether or not it's, you know, doom scrolling on Instagram, whether people are, you know, seeking information in TikTok. And I think to myself, we have these incredible doctors, these incredible physician assistants, and others who have so much knowledge. How do you take that knowledge and that expertise and make it digestible and kind of consumable for consumers on an everyday basis?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I have both marketing and communications, and so some of that is in the paid space, but a lot of that is also in the earned media space. And you know, hospitals in many ways are sort of always in crisis, and so there's also a crisis element of my role in just helping the institution navigate through that, just on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and I asked also just about your team, like what does your team look like? Is it divided up into communications and marketing, and how's that generally work?
Yeah, so so I do have sort of communications teams and marketing teams. However, I would say before I joined, I think they really operated in very separate worlds, and there probably wasn't as much cross-pollination of thinking as there is now. One thing I've said to everybody is that we are one team. And when we think about a strategy, at the same time, together, we think about what is that paid opportunity, and then how do you take that and bring it into the earned space. And so while the expertise is organized by people who focus on content, people who focus on media, people who focus on social, people who think about product marketing, people who think about brand marketing, really when we're developing a strategy, I have all of those folks at the table together. And that is a change. I think historically, institution, they did not think about it that way. And that's something that I think coming in from financial services, where I spent 22 years, was one of the experiences that I brought into the conversation.
Yeah, so talk about that journey from 22 years in financial services. Like, you began your career, I guess, in financial services, and then how did that transition happen into healthcare? That's quite a jump.
Yes, so I did. I spent 22 years in consumer banking, and I, if you asked me 10, 15 years ago whether I would be in healthcare, I absolutely would never have even thought about it, dreamt it, like it wasn't even on the radar.
Right.
A little bit about my journey. I spent 12 and a half years at American Express, which I would say is probably one of the strongest consumer marketing companies out there. It has an incredible brand. It puts the customer at the center of everything that it does. And that's really where I learned kind of the fundamental basics of core marketing, all the way from how do you acquire a new customer, how do you engage them, and how do you keep them for life. But after 12 and a half years, I decided that I needed to challenge myself with a different corporate culture and just a different challenge. And there was a leader who was leaving Amex and was going to Citi, and offered me the opportunity to be a part of the new management team that he was building. And so after losing, I don't know, I feel like 1 year's worth of sleep contemplating that decision, literally, I mean, we talked about it for a year. So I think every night for a year I was tortured. But I did decide to make that move, and I went to Citi, where I spent 6 years, ultimately was the chief marketing officer for the credit card business in the US, and also helped to stand up digital acquisition of customers around the globe for the consumer bank. And that was sort of, how do you think global, act local, particularly as you think about kind of an ad tech and MarTech stack.
Yeah.
And that was a crazy time because it was right after the financial crisis. So as you can imagine, my parents lost a lot of sleep when I was leaving Amex to go to Citi and help their way out of crisis. And but it was an incredible experience because it was reshaping the business, whether or not it was the products, our positioning, our brand, our pricing, like you name it, how you thought about loyalty and rewards, how do you bring experiences to customers and not just rational value. It was a great journey, and I loved that experience. But after 6 years, I then realized that I felt a little narrow. Like I felt like I needed to learn beyond the credit card and the deposit space, which is where I had spent most of my time. And I also realized that I was a little bit of a storm chaser, and that I enjoyed the challenge of the turnaround. And so Wells Fargo had reached out, and Wells was about 2 years after them going through reputation crisis. And they offered me the opportunity to essentially be the chief marketing officer for the consumer bank. And that let me work on everything from mortgage to auto loan to small business banking, credit card, like you name it. I got to learn new products, new industry, new consumer mindset and consumer insights. And I did that for two and a half years. Also learned a tremendous amount. I had a team all over the country, so I also learned to sort of lead in a more remote environment. I was on the road quite a bit. It was in a pre-COVID time. And but what I realized was that I had stopped, not that I had stopped learning, but the balance between sort of giving and learning wasn't there for me. And I wasn't feeling like I was growing, and I wasn't feeling like I was challenging myself enough. So there was a lot of change that was happening at Wells. And so I created the opportunity for me to step out, and I decided I just needed to do something different. And when this opportunity came to me, it like organically spoke to me. I mean, I read the job description and I thought to myself, this is an industry that is in the middle of so much transformation. Healthcare is becoming more of a consumer product in many ways. It's top of mind. It was in the midst of COVID. And I thought, oh my God, that's a challenge I want to take on. How do I be a part of that transformation? How do I help to drive that transformation? And so that was when I made the decision to leave and join healthcare. And I describe myself as I'm really a GM in how I think and how I operate. I have a functional skill in marketing. And now I feel like every element of my day almost has a piece of feeling like I'm a med student. And I'm a medicine, and that's the part that I wanted. I wanted to feel like I was learning new products, new services, and just new insights.
That's great. Well, and it's good to challenge yourself with a completely new taxonomy, that you're probably using every day, versus, to your point about feeling like a med student, you're probably using words and phrases that you never thought about before you went into healthcare.
Oh, absolutely. And I say to people, it's to make that type of change, 22 years into your career is not for everybody. Like you got to be eyes wide open because you go back to those days where you sit in meetings and like you're writing down every word that somebody is saying. It's like you're back in school, you're
Right,
like
right.
months to a year. You feel like you're literally a student. And I was up for that. I was eyes wide open. I was exhausted at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But I absolutely loved that. And that was the energy and that was sort of the fuel that I needed.
Cool. So I'm curious if there's a piece of advice you either wish you'd gotten early in your career, or maybe you would give to somebody that's early in their career starting out in terms of navigating their marketing career.
Yeah. I think there's probably two things I would say. One is never let yourself be bored. I feel that if you lose kind of your natural and organic passion or your natural curiosity or that sense of growing and learning, I think that you're not at your best. And I say to people, if you don't have an organic curiosity about the space that you're in or the work that you're doing, and you lose that, like then step away and it's time for
Yeah.
change. Because it means that you're probably not delivering your best. The people around you feel that, you feel that. And then the other thing that I think pairs with that is taking risk. I think your career is not about not taking risk. Your career is about figuring out what is the right risk to take.
Mhm.
And I say that even in my job, right? It's not that I shouldn't take any risk in my job. It's figuring out what is the right risk to take and where do you try things you've never tried before? Where do you put yourself in almost uncomfortable situations? And those are things that I think I probably took 10 years into my career to really learn and appreciate. And as soon as I was open to that risk taking, and as soon as I realized like I need to move around and I need to make change, I think I probably, not that I atrophied skills, but I probably got a little complacent at times in my career because
Mhm.
I didn't have that fuel from learning.
Makes sense. So I believe everybody has a superpower of some kind. And I'm curious either what you feel your superpower is, or maybe what people have told you your superpower is.
Yes. It's funny. I talk about this with my team all the time. And one thing I would say is I am very much an activator.
Mm.
That is what I bring to the table is I get things done. I've been an activator, I think, from the womb, as my mother would tell me. Apparently I've been this way since I was a child. And it just like accelerated as I got a job, when I was 22 years old, and it gave me activation opportunity. But I think what fuels that activation is that I'm able to infuse energy into partnerships and relationships.
Mm.
And that combination of being able to build relationship, build partnership is what fuels my ability to activate. And that's sort of the asset that I bring to my team, because I'm able to bring people along for the ride. And that, it's not just me, it's me and my team, and it's all of our partners and the cross-functional sort of infrastructure that makes it all happen. The other thing I would say is I'm an all-in person. It's
Mm.
probably sometimes a good thing, probably sometimes a bad thing. It's like when I took up running, it's not that I just took up running 3 days a week. It's like now I run 7 days a week. I approach everything in that way. And I think that's probably the biggest superpower I bring, not just to the work, but I think to my team as sort of an asset, because I genuinely feel like I'm here to work for them in order for us to deliver.
That's amazing. So I'm curious where you find inspiration either for yourself or for your team.
It's funny. I do think that sometimes when you work in very concrete verticals, right? Prior it was financial services and now it was healthcare. I think it's so easy to get too focused in your own space. So in a weird way, I sort of say that I get inspiration from kind of the world around me. And it's just
Mm.
like living life. And I try to be very observant and very tuned in to what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing just as a person, just as a
Mhm. Mhm.
right? Whether or not it's an interaction with a brand, whether it's a moment that I have when I walk into a retail storefront, whether or not it's, we're all guilty of like doom scrolling on our phones and like, what am I seeing as I'm doom scrolling at 11:30 at night and the lights are dark and I'm like not going to bed and I should be. It's like, because consumers aren't, their opinion of healthcare and their expectations of healthcare are not shaped by what's happening in healthcare. They're
Right.
shaped by what's happening in every moment and in every experience. And so I try to be really observant and sort of bring those little nuggets of ideas or little observations that I have in the marketplace to my team and say, what would be the equivalent of that for us? Or if that's consumers' expectation today, how do we need to do something different? And I sort of drop these little germs of ideas and thoughts and try to just get us outside of our space in order to inspire what we could be doing. And I think that's probably one of the things that I've tried to say to everybody on my team is that healthcare now is more like other industries.
Yeah.
People are doing research the way they research under other industries. People have a voice in the way in which they do in other industries. And so we have to start operating in that way and get that inspiration from outside of our space.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm just curious if there's certain values that you want to demonstrate to your team, or maybe values that you demand of people that are part of your team.
So a couple of things I would say. One is just an incredibly high level of integrity. I always say that integrity is at the core of everything that we do, and I have little tolerance for low integrity and accountability. You know, I say that everybody in their role, whether or not you manage a channel, a product, content, you're a media manager, a social manager, a marketing manager, you are the GM of your space. However big or small or wide or tall it is, you have to be the GM of your space, and you have to take a high degree of accountability and operate with incredible integrity. Now, the other things that I look for to fuel them is a little bit of what I said earlier, people that are willing to take that risk, because I do think that there's sort of no reward without taking some risk. I also look for people who are organically passionate about the work, because I do think that I'm going to get the best of them. And also people who are sort of courageous and curious. You know, I think people who ask questions, people who are looking outside for that inspiration, those are all sort of the qualities. And then the other thing that I believe is just a trait that matters in every role and to be successful in any way is being a strong communicator. And I say that with a little asterisk, which is not everybody needs to communicate in the same way, right? Not everybody needs to be extrovert. Not everybody needs to be able to run a room. Not everybody needs to get on a stage and rally people. But in whatever your own style is, people need to be committed to communication, because if you don't, then you don't seem transparent. And that's why those are just some of the important sort of characteristics and values that I sort of look for.
Yeah, that's great. So here at Setup, we're marketing matchmakers, and that means that we help marketers thrive by bringing them together with the best people and resources. But in practice, that usually means that we're connecting brands and agencies together. And so we live kind of in the space. We're not a marketing agency. We're not on the client side, but we live in that space in between. So I'm just curious, either, you know, at NewYork-Presbyterian or even in one of your previous lives in banking and finance, generally, how do you work with marketing agencies?
So I have always had an incredibly close and tight relationship with my agency partners. And, you know, one thing that kills me is when I hear people talk about them as vendors and sort of those horrible, horrible words. And in many ways, I don't even use the word partner, because I literally view them as an extension of my team. They're like, they're a part of my family. And the reason why I think that relationship is really important is because I want them to own the goals with me. I think sometimes people feel like, oh, agencies don't take the same accountability because they don't own the end result. I think that the way in which I manage my partnerships, my agency partners do feel like they own the end result with me. And I view their role as incredibly important because they bring diversity of skill to the job, right? Whether or not it's buying media, whether or not it's designing creative, whether or not it's thinking about ways to activate, they have experience working on all kinds of businesses and all kinds of industry. And they can bring that experience to me because my experience is limited to what I've had a chance to work on in my career. And I also allow them to challenge me. There are definitely times where, you know, my initial reaction to a creative concept or a media approach or a production approach or a director's point of view is one way. And my agency will push me and they will push my thinking and challenge my thinking. And so I have always had agencies close to me, and I give them that permission to challenge me and say to them, like, when we're in the room together, I want you to convince me otherwise in many, and that makes for a really healthy relationship.
For sure. I'm curious if there are certain disciplines of marketing that you feel you really benefit most by getting an outside perspective, or are there certain disciplines where you feel like I really need to own this as part of my team or in-house because it's so core to my business that I don't want to have somebody, else touching it?
Absolutely. So what I would say is probably when it comes to media, I just think that the media landscape is changing so often in terms of where the media opportunities are, the technology, the data, the targeting, like all the tools of that. I think outsourcing it and having a partner is important because they're always going to be on the cutting edge of what's available in a way in which if you bring it fully in-house, I think you lose a little bit of that. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I think creative because they bring that diversity of experience to the table. And I think that adds an element and elevates the work. The type of stuff that I tend to keep more in-house is more of the content that has to do with like content for social, content for media placement, for earned media placement, because that is about interacting, particularly in my current industry, with our doctors, with our nurses, with our front line, and having those relationships to know what is an incredible patient story that's happening. How do we be there from the beginning so we can capture that journey from the beginning to the end so that we can tell that story? And that's about having those close relationships internally. So a lot of the content that we do for media pitching or for our social channels, or we have a content hub called Health Matters, that type of work I keep internally because that relationship with our sort of our product, which is our doctors and our care, is incredibly important.
That makes complete sense. So I'm curious, we often as marketers have to work with non-marketing functions within the organization. So the chief medical officer and the chief procurement officer and the CEO and other people on the team. So how do you demonstrate the value of marketing to those who don't live and breathe marketing all day, every day?
Well, a couple of things. One is there's always that ongoing education that you need to do about like the role of marketing and what's quantifiable, what's less quantifiable. I always say to people, in the past, people used to have sort of the funnel conversation, and it was this very sort of linear like funnel. I actually don't believe the funnel works that way anymore. I actually think it's more of a journey that looks like this, and people are like, they're looking in search and then they see a media piece and then they're back to search and then they see something in Instagram. Like there's an influencer component. It's a much more, it's a journey opposed to being this funnel. So part of it is just educating people about that. But my philosophy in general is sort of a show me, don't tell me approach. And I believe that way in the work that I do and how I think about results. And I think there's an element of quantitative results. There's an element of qualitative results. So when I think about qualitative results, I do brand tracking and I'm looking at things like, out of 10 people in New York, how many of them are associating, our brand with us? And what is that sentiment? And that's more of call it a little bit more qualitative, even though there's numbers there. And then quantitative results. What are we doing in terms of driving engagement, driving clicks, driving appointment? How many people are searching for doctors? I grew up in financial services where I could literally measure every single interaction all the way down to somebody opening a deposit account and somebody getting a mortgage. I don't have exactly that same rigor in healthcare because your need for a cardiologist and your need for a neurologist might not come until later. Right. But I can certainly measure, am I driving an engagement? Am I driving them to look for one of our physicians? Am I driving them to spend time with our content? And I believe in measuring and putting numbers on paper to sort of socialize that impact with the organization. Because at the end of the day, and I say to my team, we can tell beautiful stories. We can make people cry when they hear the stories about what we've done to save lives. At the end of the day, that doesn't matter unless you are driving growth and loyalty into the institution.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm curious if there's a campaign or a program, either at NewYork-Presbyterian or in your previous life, that taught you a great lesson because it was a miserable flop and you needed to learn that lesson, or it was a huge success and maybe you'd like to emulate that in the future.
So I'm actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to give you two answers to that. I'm going to give one flop and one less flop. So great. One thing I would say, let's start with the good, which was currently right now, the brand for NewYork-Presbyterian is under the words of stay amazing. And that was a rebrand that we did when I first came in. So I joined the organization in July of 21. very, very quickly, within days almost, acknowledged and realized that there was a need to refresh the brand. And the brand hadn't really been touched for the better part of almost 20 years. And while a very solid brand, it was more insular and it was much more focused on us, opposed to our end customer and consumer. And what are we doing for them? It was also a time where the world was still in COVID, but sort of trying to make our way back to quote unquote, whatever the new normal was. And so both our internal stakeholders, like our employees, and consumers in the marketplace needed a dose of inspiration. Like people were just like looking for hope. And I thought, here's this opportunity for us. And I wanted to open the aperture to the conversation we started with, which is that healthcare is not just about fix me, I'm sick, but healthcare is about being your partner in your wellness journey, from the things that you do in a preventative manner, all the way to the things that you might need from a reactive perspective. And so we sort of went out there in a very bold way and said, we're going to completely reposition the brand. We're going to launch this new brand, Stay Amazing. We had a new brand promise, which is about as your life evolves, like your world of wellness grows around you. And bring consumers into that conversation. And what makes me so proud of it is that the numbers show that it has had a significant impact. When I look at the number of New Yorkers who associate the new brand with us, almost in record time, it's like, 4 out of 10 New Yorkers actually associate it with us. And many brands take 10 years to see numbers like that. The second thing I would say is, our engagement with our brand, whether it be websites, website visits, whether it's people looking and searching for our doctors, whether or not it's people clicking on our content through Google search and other things, is all significantly up. So I feel very proud of that. But the reason that what makes me most proud of it was there was absolutely no playbook. And we were doing something that was very different. And we were reshaping what healthcare marketing is. It's less about doctors and white coats and scrubs and medical stuff that looks kind of shiny and fancy and technical, but it was about the people. And there was no playbook, and we took the risk. And that to me is what makes me so proud of that work. And we did it in almost 6 weeks. We launched.
Wow, that's really fast.
Yeah. I know it was sort of crazy. And then the flip side that I would say was an experience when I was at American Express. We were working on a product that was a very, very innovative product at its moment in time. And it was a product that allowed you to sort of customize the benefits on your credit card. And instead of having this predetermined package of these points and these rewards and this access, it allowed you to customize the card to say, well, this is the type of point accelerator I wanted, and this is the type of benefit I wanted. And what I would say is, it wasn't that it was a flop because the work was bad, but we, as a marketing team, I think didn't identify that we were a little bit ahead of its time. It was not at a time when people were creating custom playlists like they are today.
Right.
It was a time where it was just too complicated. People were like, well, why do I have to make these choices? And
Right.
And like,
just give it to me. Give me what I want.
Yeah,
right.
If I'm an enthusiast of this type of topic, and this is my passion area, like decide for me, like don't give me an a la carte menu. And what I felt was we missed that the world wasn't quite ready for that. I think if you fast forward a few years in a world where now, like, you don't buy a whole album, you buy the song you want. I think it could work today, but at the time we sort of missed that it was too complicated. And that didn't end up doing well. And so we learned a lot from that about make sure that you're totally in tune with the marketplace's readiness level for where you are. Even though you have an innovative idea, the market needs to be ready for it.
Yeah, you said something hilarious. We don't buy songs either.
No,
we don't buy them.
Yes, that's right. We don't even buy them anymore.
We don't even buy them anymore, right? Like things have changed so rapidly that the way we consume content and is totally different now too. All right, well, I've got a couple of questions to wrap things up just for fun that have nothing to do necessarily with marketing specifically. I'm curious if there's a quote or a book or a sports team or a band or a movie that inspires you, and what about that thing inspires you?
One of the quotes that I love, which you might have heard before, because I think it's one that many people love, which is, Maya Angelou always said, people don't always remember what you say or even what you do, but they'll always remember the way that you make them feel. And that is something that I think about a lot because, and for two reasons. One is because of my strength and also because of my almost like development area, which is from a strength perspective, I am one of those people that people say that I can walk into a room and sort of infuse energy. And I always think about that because that is part of what I'm saying my superpower is. And so making sure that I use that, because that is the takeaway that people have. The flip side is that I am such an activator, and I also believe in efficient activation. And and the same way I can infuse energy, I can probably also like completely deflate a room at the same time. And so I always think about that in managing my energy, managing that balance between, activation and kind of taking a step back to make sure, am I like over activating?
Yeah.
Because that
Not overwhelming them really, because it could be overwhelming, I'm sure.
Exactly. And that's why that quote, I think, is just a beautiful quote from a beautiful author, and just makes me think a lot about my behavior and the choices I make and how I operate.
That's great. So I'm curious where you find joy outside of work, other than family, because that's an easy, obvious one. But do you have some hobbies or things you love to do that really activate you outside of work?
Yes. And so, this is probably touche in the fact that I'm in the healthcare space, but several years ago, I actually decided to commit to being a runner. And that to me is like my commitment to wellness is actually where I find joy. Like when I'm in Central Park and I'm running around the reservoir and in the mornings, and I try to run almost every day, that is my time, because it's the time when I find joy, I clear my head, I think about just a whole host of random things go through my head. It's when I listen to music. It's when I sometimes listen to a podcast, and I find a lot of joy in that. And so it's not just exercise to me; it's me time for me.
Yeah.
And I'm a much nicer person for it. And so that's one thing. And the second thing I would say is I believe that life is about collecting experiences. I always say that I'm a product of my generation. Like, I don't care how large my office is. Like, it's not about that material. Yeah. It's about seeing the world, and it's about sitting and having a long, lazy brunch with my friends and remembering the funny thing we laughed about. And that is, life is about collecting experiences, and whether that's traveling, whether that's, again, sitting at a dining table, that brings me joy.
Okay. That's fantastic. I do think we collect relationships and experiences. I think those are two things that along the way, it's like build relationships, collect experiences is a great perspective. All right, my last question for you is just, is there a brand that you've never worked on you've always admired, and what is it about the brand that you admire?
There's two things. There are two brands that I think about a lot. One is Nike. I'm a Nike girl. I do run in my Nikes.
Yeah.
But I think that they bring, they say that they bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete. And what I love is that the way in which they define an athlete is, if you have a body, you are an athlete.
Yeah.
And they have expanded that conversation, and that they celebrate everybody as an athlete, and that everybody can have that mindset. And the other thing I appreciate them about as a brand is that they always have an opinion, and they're a brand with a voice. You might not always agree with their point of view, because they can sometimes get a little bit political, but I do appreciate them as a brand, and they're a performance brand. And if you look at the work that we're producing today at New York-Presbyterian, it has a little Nike-esque to it, and that we're trying to lean into that performance feeling, and that you leave everything feeling like you're ready to go and you're inspired. And then the other brand that I admire quite a bit is actually the Four Seasons. And the reason I say that is because rather than having a lofty vision or some major, vision that feels totally unattainable, one of the things that they talk about as a brand is sort of that consistent thread of service and service innovation. So they talk about themselves as a brand if it's a collection of little things that we do for our customer, and that is their vision. And that's a very unusual approach. And I give them a lot of credit for being kind of this luxury brand that is saying it's not about this up here, it's about those little things and those little moments. I just think that that's sort of a daring approach. So
I love that. Well, Devika Mathrani, the Chief Marketing Communications Officer for New York-Presbyterian. Thank you so much, Devika. This has been such an amazing conversation. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. This was great. I appreciate it. Thank you.